Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling...
All right, so backing up to verse 10, just to get a little context. And you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather its yield, but on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. And so this is the 7th year fallow that was proclaimed. There's two basic reasons in this context that are given. One is so that the needy have something to eat. So whatever grows in that field on that 7th year, just voluntarily, the needy could harvest from. There's also, you'll recall, portions of your field that you harvested that would not be completely harvested, or anything that was not gathered the first pass through had to be left. That also was for the needy. So there was plenty of food being left for them. But then the point is made that after the needy gathered what they wanted, the rest of it was to be left for the animals. There's some reason for that's given. I don't think that that's all of the reason, but that is some direct reason that's in this text. Then verse 12 says, 6 days you are to do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female slave as well as your stranger may refresh themselves. And I'll stop there for a moment. This is different than the description of the Sabbath as it was given in in Exodus 20, when the law was given. And what is that? Exodus 20, around verse 7, I think it is, where the Sabbath is first introduced. What is the reason there that he places for the Sabbath? Anybody recall? Yeah. In 6 days, God made the world. On the 7th day, he rested. So there's an aspect of it that's kind of a memorial to the creation story and to remembering those things. And so I work for 6 days, and the 7th day I rest. God worked for 6 days. On the 7th day, he rested. But this context gives some secondary reasons. So he says, 6 days you shall do your work. On the 7th day you shall cease from your labor, in order that your ox and your donkey may rest. So your animals need a break. And this is for that purpose. And the son of your female slave as well as your stranger may refresh themselves. And so the people that are working for you need a day off as well. And so those are some secondary reasons that he gave for the Sabbath. You'll notice there's a connection. The 7th year fallow, the land Sabbath, was to feed people and animals. And the weekly Sabbath is to give rest to people and animals. And so there's a theme that's going on here. These things are talking about laws that are applying to your fellow man. And in this particular case, to those who have charge under you. And it's a reflection, really of both of the two great commandments. But more specifically, this one is a reflection of you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You need to consider. The other thing is, look, the guy who owned the vineyard was not the guy doing all the hard lifting. The guy doing all the hard lifting was the guy who worked for him. It would be easy for the guy who owned the vineyard to say, we're going to run this thing 7 days a week. And you ought to be able to, I'm out here, you're out here, let's all. But the fact of the matter is those guys were the ones that were working, and God says you need to think about them. And they need time to refresh and rest. Now concerning everything which I have said to you, be on your guard. Do not mention the name of other gods, nor let them be heard from your mouth. This particular situation, what's absent from these commandments that was present in all these other commandments that we've been looking at, going back to the laws about the Sabbath, going back to the social laws, going back to animals that were damaging property and people are killing or stealing or all those other things that he's already talked about. What's different about these commandments than those previous commandments? Okay. But some of those, I mean, the commandments started, the 10 commandments started with, thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second one is, thou shalt not have a graven image. So those are dealing with God. But when you get to the expression of the law, what we've seen up to this point is don't do this or this is the consequence. Don't do this or this. What has happened in these verses? What's the consequence for saying another God's name? He doesn't say, look, you're going to be stoned for doing this. If a child talked back to his parent, what was the penalty? He was to be stoned. He says, don't have any other God's name in your mouth. But then he says nothing about this is the penalty that's going to be enforced for this. These are laws about the heart. These are simply commands that he hasn't built enforcement teeth to these things, at least not immediate enforcement teeth. They have long range. The same situation that we're in other words. We have obligations in the covenant that's made with man through Christ. We have the obligation to repent. Are there people who don't repent? Okay, what do we do to those people? We leave them to God. There's an obligation to confess Christ with your mouth. What if someone doesn't confess Christ? What are you supposed to do with them? We leave them to the judgment of God. We're commanded to be baptized. What about people who choose not to be baptized? When is all their... Okay, so let's just imagine that I have this strong rebellious streak in me and I decide, you know what, I am not going to confess Christ. I am not going to repent of my sins. I'm going to keep living the way I want to live. And there's no way in the world you're going to get me into water baptism. Absolutely not going to happen. What happens to me? Nothing immediate. But ultimately, I stand to give an account of myself to God on the day of judgment. Same kind of situation here. Not every command of the old law was for temporal purposes and for management of the society. You get a lot of that. People talk about, well, these were their civil laws as well. They had a theocracy, and these were their civil laws as well. Well, yeah, but that's not all of the law of Moses. This was about people listening to this commandment and saying, you know what? God doesn't want me to even talk about false gods, so I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just not going to acknowledge them. I'm only going to acknowledge him. And that's a choice that individuals had to make. And a choice that they would answer for. And sometimes when you don't have immediate consequences, you forget that there is an accounting. Right. And that feeds in to the very next thing that he says. We're going to look at it from the opposite side of that now. So if that's true, if there's no immediate consequence and it makes it harder for me to realize, wait a minute, I shouldn't be doing this, what happens if I don't acknowledge the things that I take? He's saying don't acknowledge things that you shouldn't acknowledge in verse 13. Don't talk about the false gods. Concerning everything which I've said to you, be on your guard. Do not mention the name of other gods. Don't acknowledge them. Do not let them be heard from your mouth. And then the very next thing he says is, 3 times a year you shall celebrate a feast for me. So on the other side of that coin is, you need to regularly remember me and talk about me and celebrate me. And if you do this regularly, what happens? You don't forget about me. So if I'm not talking about false gods, but I am celebrating the true and living God, what effect does that have in my life? We should be focused on God. We should remember God and keep God holy and consider what he has said. And when we're out there living life and making decisions, stop ourselves and say, what would God have me to do? Now, this has some very practical applications for our living today, even under the new covenant. What kind of regular memorials does he ask from us? Okay, so we got a weekly memorial that is specifically focused upon what? Christ and what Christ did for us. What else does he want us to do, and how often does he want us to do it? That keeps us engaged with him as opposed to being engaged with the world. Pray. He says pray without ceasing. Now, that doesn't literally mean spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year praying, but that means have a constant, regular engagement with me. Talk to me. If we're talking to him regularly, if our prayer routine is regular and is daily, what is more likely? I'll tell you what's more likely, that we're going to be thinking about God and thinking about the things connected with God. If we allow ourselves to live 6 days a week where we never consider God, what's going to happen on the first day of the week? We're going to forget about God. Eventually, we're going to forget about God. Eventually, we're not going to be here. Eventually, he'll disappear from our mind altogether, and instead, what will replace it? The things that we're thinking about. Malachi likens withholding the tithe as robbing God. I guess the way Paul was inspired to talk about these things is whatever is good, whatever is of good repute, and whatever. Let your mind dwell on these things. Which he's saying, meditate upon the good things that are associated with God and his word, not the things of the world. How would Jesus talk about it? Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven rather than treasures on the earth. It's all the same kind of thing. We got the same contrast going on here. Don't focus on these earthly, human-designed concepts of God. Instead, remember and celebrate me. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. He's going to enumerate these feasts. Feast of unleavened bread for 7 days. You are to eat unleavened bread as I commanded you at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. So there was a week-long period that they were not supposed to eat things that were leavened, that were associated with these things. So we've got the unleavened bread, this week-long that began when? Anybody know when it began? Passover. That's when it began. That's why they ate the feast that evening of Christ's arrest and crucifixion. That was the beginning of the observance of this feast. Also, you shall observe the Feast of Harvest. The Feast of Harvest, I think, is also referred to as the Feast of Weeks. And we know it as Pentecost. Feast of Harvest, of the first fruits of your labors from what you sow in the field, and also the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather the fruit of your labors from the fruit. So you've got these 3 periods, this marker of remembering when I delivered you out of Egypt and death passed over you. You remember that event. At the beginning of the process of the planting and harvesting, at the beginning of that process, you have a feast then, and then you have another feast at the end of the year when you actually harvest, when you ingather. And I think that there is some overarching teaching going on in that as well about the big picture of what's going on with God. What did Jesus teach? Behold, the fields are ripe unto harvest. He talks in another place about putting in the sickle and reaping the harvest. I think all that is tied into this, the symbolism of this, but all of it's designed, he's made very clear, so that they remember God. They remember the provisions of God and the providence of God and how God is involved in their life and how God delivered them from death. In other words, those feasts to them were very similar to what the Lord's Supper is intended to be for us every week, that we recall what Christ did for us, what God did for us to deliver us from sin and death and to give us hope. You shall observe the Feast of Harvest, the first fruits of your labors, verse 16, from what you sow in the field, also the Feast of the Ingathering, from your labors from the field. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor is the fat of my feast to remain overnight until morning. You shall bring the choice first fruits of your soil into the house of the Lord your God. Stop. There's a period there in my text, and we're going to stop there. All of that from verse 14 to where I just stopped halfway through verse 19 is all talking about what? Acknowledging and worshiping God. And it ends with this statement. Bring the first fruits. Don't bring anything but the first fruits into my house. Actually, it ends with a dual statement. Don't offer a sacrifice to me with anything but unleavened bread. Now, that imagery continues throughout the rest of the Bible as well. What is sin? As it's talked about, for instance, in 1 Corinthians. Leaven. Impurity. Don't come to my altar and offer leavened bread with the blood of the sacrifice. The next statement is, give me the first fruits, which is the same thing as saying what? Give me what you have off the top. I won't, and generally it's viewed as being the best. I don't know if it's literally the best. I don't know if you can say that the first apple that you get off the apple tree every year is the best apple that the tree's going to produce that year. I don't know that you can say that. I don't think that's the point. The point is, you've been waiting for this fruit to ripen. And the first thing that you get, not for you, the first thing that you get, that's for God. God goes first. When I was a kid, it's not the way it's done anymore, I understand that. But when I was a kid, the kids ate last. When you had a big family gathering, the adults ate first, and then the kids ate. You didn't have this take care of all the kids first thing. It was more important that the adults ate. By the way, we did view that as being a rank order thing. The other thing was, is even if you were lucky enough to get to eat the same time as the adults, first off, you were at the back of the line. You didn't start the line. But even if you did get to get your plate and go to the table at the same time, we didn't get to sit at the same table. There was the table, and then there was the kids' table. And if you had a big family and you were the youngest kid, you were unlucky, and there might not even be a place for you at the kids' table. You might just be sitting on the floor somewhere, using a cooler as a table. And that's if you were lucky and had a cooler to use as a table. That's the common thing that happens today. But that is not necessarily the way it was always done. You know what young people were being taught? That the world did not revolve around them. I'm told that years ago, preachers would get invited to people's homes for lunch after Sunday morning service, and apparently fried chicken was a popular thing to serve them, based on what I've read and what I've heard people tell stories about. But you know who got served first? The guest, the preacher. More often than not, the way it actually worked out, in practical terms, who was the last person that actually got their food? The cook. The host of the thing was actually usually. Now, in a traditional American household, the husband would have been served, but the lady that slaved in the kitchen and made it all usually got hers last. There's something to be said. Why give your guests the first portion? We do this at weddings too. Who gets the first piece of cake, the first bite of cake? The bride and the groom. Why? They're being honored. It's the same thing. If we're honoring God, he says, well, you give me the first when it's fresh. That's the other thing I'll say. The harvest comes in, and it tends to come in under a short period of time, and then you've got to store stuff. Which is better, the fresh stuff or the stored stuff that's old? The fresh stuff is better. There's a few things that you can store and maintain their quality. Potatoes don't get too bad too fast if you store them properly. You can store onions for a long time if you store them properly. But most things, the quality deteriorates over time. When do you give it to God? Now, the very first that you get and the very freshest that there is, that goes to God. That is an acknowledgement of the respect that you're showing God. And then he says, now this is what he's been talking about for, what is this, 6 verses, 5.5 verses. He's been talking about the quality of our engagement with God. And then we read, you are not to boil a kid in the milk of its mother. Someone please explain to me what that means and why it's here. What is that about? Is he just sticking a cooking instruction in the middle of this? Is that what this is? By the way, I'll just go ahead and tell you that statement, that exact statement appears 3 times in the Bible. Twice, it's coupled with you must offer God the first fruits. And then it follows, you shall not boil a kid in his mother's milk. I think that's Exodus 34:26, as well as this one in 23. It also appears in Deuteronomy 14:21, in a context that is, in fact, talking about the dietary restrictions up to that point. But you know what it starts talking about in verse 22 and following? Sacrifices to God. The same thing that's under discussion here. I think that the phrase is connected to the discussion about the sacrifices to God more than the dietary things. I don't think this has anything to do with cooking. I don't think it's to be taken literal. I don't think he was saying, hey, you're not allowed to cook a goat in its mother's milk for the sake of saying you're not allowed to do this thing. I think it more than likely is an idiom that they would have understood to mean don't profane things, because that's what he's talking about. You don't eat, you don't offer my blood sacrifices with leavened bread. You give me the first fruits. And this is the way one person explained it. And by the way, there are a lot of different people that offer a lot of different ideas, and there is no place in the Bible anywhere that says, this is what I mean by this statement. So we're left to trying to deduce from what's there. The best explanation that I've read up to this point, and I may change my mind at some point if somebody comes up with a better idea and I'm persuaded by it, but he's saying, okay, think about it like this. He's just said, you offer the Lord your God the first fruits. What he's saying is, don't take the leftover grain from last year and a little bit of the first fruits and mix it together and offer that to God, and then keep the rest of the first fruits for yourself. Don't mix the old with the new. Do we have that kind of teaching in the New Testament as well? Jesus saying things like what? Don't put new wine in old wineskins. Don't put a new cloth on an old garment. All of which is saying that things need to be done properly and decently and not profane. I would argue that it's the same sentiment that Jesus had when he taught, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. There are profane things and there are holy things. Don't mix them. Keep my worship pure. Don't drag in the old. What had they left? What had they left? They hadn't been out of Egypt very long at this point. In Egypt, what was going on? Idolatry, which they carried with them. This isn't very far removed from the foot of the mountain either, where they gave all their gold jewelry that they had just apparently gotten from the Egyptians to Aaron and said, make us a calf. And he's saying, don't drag that old stuff in here. Another general application. What was happening in the land of Canaan that they were eventually going to take possession of? What did the people that occupied that land do? They engaged in profane worship. Don't mix what they got with what you're offering me. I think this is an idiom that's saying, keep it pure, keep it right, keep it proper. It makes more sense to me, because that makes this to be three statements that are essentially underscoring the same point. He says, don't offer leavened bread on the altar. Bring me the choice first fruits. And then to put an exclamation point on it, he uses an idiom that they can remember. Otherwise, I don't have anything for this. I don't know how it fits in the context other than that. It comes out of left field, and then he goes right into after that by saying this, behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way. What does that have to do with boiling the milk, a kid in its mother's milk? I mean, it doesn't fit in this context at all unless it is not intended to be literal. Unless it is simply saying, listen, keep my worship where it ought to be and keep it pure. Yes, ma'am. Well, and that's very similar to don't pull Egypt with you, and don't pull Canaan with you, and don't. For us, it's the same story. I don't think anybody sitting in this room is in any danger of pulling animal sacrifices and circumcision into our worship. But you know what we are very likely to pull into our worship? The worldly mindset of the society that we live in. Go to a worship service somewhere sometime and see what they look like. I'm going to tell you what they look like. They look exactly like what happens on Sunday morning in a lot of buildings with organizations calling themselves church. What happens on Sunday morning looks exactly the same thing as what was going on Saturday night in the concert hall. They are pulling society and the values of society and the things that are enjoyed in common life into the worship of God. They are not keeping them distinct. And we need to be very careful about that. Book a number of years ago was written called The Cultural Church by a fellow that his father was a very devout, faithful gospel preacher. There's some people who have some problems with some of his views. I have some problems with some of his views, the guy who wrote it. But the whole point and premise of the cultural church is that we're dragging our culture into the Lord's church. And he's absolutely right. There is a decidedly American flavor to our worship. And it works the other way around. And I think that the point that's being made in this block is, guys, do not be influenced by the world when it comes to these things. You keep it pure and holy. You keep it about me, and you let this influence you rather than you influence this. Was the Sabbath made for man or man for the Sabbath? Jesus asked that question at one point too. What's the answer to that question? The Sabbath was made for man. Sabbath is supposed to help us remember. We weren't made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to serve us. Worship is the same way. We're not supposed to be influencing our worship. We're supposed to be influenced by our worship. God gave it to us to keep our mind focused on Him, to keep us aware of what He's done, to keep us focused on spiritual things as far as material. It's easy to focus on material things. I go out on a baseball field, I get hit in the nose with a baseball, I immediately know I got a body. I don't have any problem recognizing I have a body. If I stub my toe, I got a body. Actually, now is my current age. If I get out of bed, I immediately know I have a body. That's not the hard thing to remember. What's the hard thing to remember? That I'm a spirit created in the image and likeness of God that exists beyond this life. And that is what our culture has forgotten too. Our culture doesn't recognize that there is life beyond the grave and that there are things that are more important than the mundane things, the worries, the riches, and the pleasures of this life. He gave us our worship and prayer. Does God need for us to pray? No, he knows what we're going to ask before we even ask it. And yet he still says, pray without ceasing. Who is that for? It's for me. So that I don't forget that God is there, and I don't forget that God is listening, and I don't forget that God is providing for me. And so that's what this is all about. I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. You're going to a place, and it's a place he says, I've prepared for you, and I'm actively having you guided to that place. Who's the actor? I'll say it that way. Who's the actor in all of this, according to verse 20? God is. I am sending. I am guarding. I am bringing. I have prepared. Listen, there's a lesson in that for us too. When we get to the end of our journey, it's not because of what Michael has done if I end up in the promised land. It's because of what God has prepared and what God has guarded and what God has done. This is applicable to me and you just like it was to them. And that, yes, ma'am. Yes, God is with us. Always. The 18th next week? Is that right? We're gonna pick this up in verse 24 next week. I'm gonna go ahead and give you a preview real quick. We're gonna see that after he makes this promise, he then tells them not to worship the gods of the lands that they're going to drive out their enemies. Don't make covenants with the people. What's all that about? Well, the same thing that all this has been about that we talked about tonight. Don't compromise yourself with these things. This, you have to keep it pure. If you don't keep it pure, then it doesn't do the thing that he designed it to do.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all